decades. There is something very arbitrary and very false about it pretending that on January the 1st, 1960, everything suddenly changed dramatically and stayed exactly as it was until December the 31st, 1969, because it wasn't like that at all. There were huge changes through the decade, and there were things that happened before January the 1st, 1960, and things that happened after December the 31st, 1969. So decades are just a way in which historians divide the world up, but they're not necessarily the only way or the best way. And I'm going to start actually in 1956. I want to juxtapose the idea of cultural adventurers against cultural consumers, and I don't mean by that that you were one or the other in the 60s, because I think we were all that to some extent. Now, I think to a large extent I've always been a bit of a cultural adventurer. I've always been interested in new ideas, new stuff, new fashions, new sounds in music, and so on and so on. And certainly some people that I know who had a great time in the 60s weren't interested in that at all. They like mainstream fashion, they like mainstream pop hits, they like the top 20 and so on and so on. I make no judgment about that. I simply think it's interesting for each of us to consider the extent to which we were cultural adventurers and the extent to which we were happy to be consumers of what was being offered to us within popular mass culture. And I'm very interested in ideas about Portsmouth. There were one or two people in the audience who've already heard me talk in the past about the question of why it was that there was such a thriving, exciting culture of popular music and popular culture in Portsmouth in the 60s that somehow made very little impact on the rest of the world. There were lots of us in bands, and I was one of those people who got very close to making it, to getting record contracts, to getting albums out and so on, and somehow in the end it didn't happen. And why was that? And I might float one or two ideas about that. And then there's a broader question about what do I mean by popular music? Personal histories. This is a quick one really, just to contextualise where I come from in all of this, okay? That's my grandfather. 1932, he was really a jeweller and watchmaker, and he had a shop in Granada Road in Southsea where he sold records. And I bought this cardboard sleeve, because in those days you didn't have the name of the artist on the sleeve, you had the name of the shop. I bought it from a man called Frank Herlock, who had a shop above the music shop in Marmion Road, and he found it. And it was my grandfather selling records in 1932. My grandfather was also a very good singer, and he was offered an audition with the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company, and his father, my great-grandfather, wouldn't let him go. That's one of the things that changed between the 1920s and the 1960s, as you will hear. I have a very brief memory of my first encounter with rock and roll popular music, which was a rainy playtime in Highland Road School, which is now Craneswater School in Albert Road, where some kids got up in the class because we had to stay in for this rainy playtime. Well, I was about 7, and they sang Rock Around the Clock, and I couldn't bear it. I wanted it to be me. Absolutely couldn't bear it. From that moment onwards, I wanted to do what I'm doing now, which is to show off on a stage in front of other people. And I've done lots of it. And that's where I started. What about those sandals? Groovy, huh? Incidentally, I never did master the guitar, but by 1968, I did have my name for the only time in my life on a real record as a songwriter, which is a bit odd, really, when you think about it, but I did. So that was rather nice. And there I am. And the thing I really like about this is that... Now, look, there is an excuse for this. I only ever look like that on stage in a band, honest. But what I really like about it is that on the left is my grandfather, the singer and seller of records, yeah? And in the middle is my dad, at about the same age as me there, and he wants to look like his father. And on the right-hand side is me, and I don't want to look like my father at all. And that seems to me to be symbolic of an important shift in the 60s. In case you think my father was completely alienated by this, I have to tell you it's his rosebush and his photograph. He was so, I don't know what, I suppose the contemporary word would be gobsmacked that his son would come home looking like that he took me out in front of the rosebush and took the photograph. And there I am. I don't dress like that anymore. Shared histories, okay. Theatre Royal Portsmouth. Why here in this particular building when normally we do public lectures in the university? Well, two reasons. Firstly, I wanted people to come from Portsmouth rather than from the university, so I wanted it to be a public space. But second, because a most extraordinary thing happened in this building, and I don't think many people know about it. There's a bloke called Pete Frame who writes Rock Family Trees, and many of you will know about that and have seen the television programme versions of it and so on. And he also wrote a geographical rock history of England. And one of the things he attributes to Portsmouth is this. There is a guy called Tony Crombeen, who was a very fine bebop dance band drummer in the 40s and 50s, who, on the basis of Bill Haley's success in 54, 55, decided to start a rock and roll group. And he modelled it on the Bill Haley group. So Bill Haley and his Comets becomes Tony Crombeen and his Rockets. And they are apparently, I'm prepared to believe this because I like the story, the first touring British rock and roll band. And the first gig that they ever did was in this theatre, following this popular variety bill, on the 10th of September 1956. First bit of music now. I'm just going to play you. I've got to pray that all this is going to work here. If everything works here, I'm going to play you a little snatch of Tony Crombeen and his Rockets and a song called Let's You and I Rock.
Let's you and I rock. If you're looking for a bow with lots of dough, a guy with money and stocks, well, I've got dough and more. Let's you and I rock. There's a time to save your money and the time to save your soul. But I think that this time, honey, it's the time to rock and roll. If you're looking for a man with a handsome pan.
Rock and roll, early 50s, has a massive impact. This is Paulsgrove. It's a brother and sister called Tony and Jill. And we shall come to their, or a development in their story a bit later on. The image is rather like the image of me in the garden with the guitar and the sorry sandals. You know, it's about the idea that what happened with rock and roll was that it created the opportunity for people of my generation to dream. The problem with watching Duke Ellington, Modern Jazz Quartet, Johnny Lyne, was that you couldn't dream of doing it unless you were an extraordinarily accomplished musician. And I had exactly the same experience as a school teacher in the late 70s, 76, 77, when punk happened. And lots of school teachers that I was working with hated punk, and I thought punk was great because suddenly the kids bought guitars and played music. It was terrible. It's just like the terrible music we played, but they played it. And there is just nothing more wonderful than being allowed and able to get up in front of people and play music. It is the most wonderful thing to be allowed to do, even when you're crap. And I've certainly done that. And so this is Tony and Jill in Paulsgrove playing, learning to play, learning to imagine. You know, it's that wonderful capacity to imagine yourself something other than just stood in a street in Paulsgrove playing a guitar, being somewhere else, inhabiting some other exciting space in the world that's really important. This is a group from Gosport called the Brothers Scarlet. I mean, the guy on the left is just fantastic. It's just an image that's full of dream, full of hope and aspiration. It's just wonderful. And they became a really successful local band, actually. But this is them doing what we did, you know, in the bedroom, in the front room, you know, driving your parents nuts. And here's Frank Kelly and the Cresters. And on the right-hand side, Tony and Jill again, down in the bottom corner. They've now progressed to Frank Kelly and the Cresters, who are one of the big groups of the time. Now, the really big group of the time is Frank Kelly and the Hunters, and sadly I have no photographs of Frank Kelly and the Hunters to show you. But Frank Kelly and the Hunters released 4 singles on Fontana. I'm looking at Mick, who's nodding. Thank you, Mick. Yeah, 4 singles on Fontana, one of which was a cover of Send Me the Pillow You Dream On. And they were pretty good songs, really. And I'm going to play a different one. I'm going to play a song called I Saw Linda Yesterday, and this is simply because my first girlfriend in the 60s was called Linda. So I have no idea where she is now, but this is for her.
Hip, hip, doodle-doodle, night didn't seem so long no more. Rain wasn't there like it was before. Just
Okay, here's a crucial moment in Portsmouth history, and to this day, I've never met anybody else who went to this, and I'd like to meet somebody who went to it because I'd like to find out about it. This is the first gig that the Beatles ever did in Portsmouth. It was at the Guildhall. It was on a Saturday night, 2 shows, 6:30 and, I don't know, 8 o'clock or something. They weren't on the bill originally, top of the bill. Chris Montez and Tommy Rowe are the 2 guys in the middle. The only thing I can remember about seeing it is I remember Chris Montez doing a version of La Bamba and gradually taking all his top clothes off. He kept his trousers on, but the rest of it came, and I think the girls thought that was quite impressive. I can remember absolutely nothing about the Beatles, but I saw them. It was in March 1963. Now, the stories in popular history are that the Beatles weren't to top the bill, but by this time were getting so big with Please Please Me that they were top of the bill. I don't think they were at Portsmouth. I think they finished the first half, and I've always believed that. It's in my memory, but I might be wrong. And if you read the reviews in the Portsmouth Evening News, it doesn't tell you. It just says the Beatles were better than the Americans. There's a lot about that, and you can read that in the booklet. But it was a big deal. They came back twice. They came to the Savoy about a month later. Bit more about that in a minute. And then in December, they came back again, and this is it you? I don't know. It might be one of you. I went to this as well with my sister. Now, this was a famous gig because lots of us have got tickets for this one, and the tickets say November, but in fact what happened was Paul McCartney was taken ill, and we all assembled in the Guildhall Square, and we were all absolutely devastated because the Beatles didn't play, but they came back a month later and they did play, and this was the gig. And it is absolutely true that I probably sat about as far back as the back row there and couldn't hear a thing. Absolutely couldn't hear a thing. I did the first time, but I couldn't hear anything. It just screams and screamed and screamed. And so they played 3 times in Portsmouth in 1963, and then they went to America, and that was it, really. Although they did go to Southampton in 1964, which I think was a tactical mistake, really. I always liked the Rolling Stones better after that.
I'm gonna go and try to lend the back. I don't care no more like I did before. She's gonna cry. Yeah, I'm gonna make her blue 'cause I found somebody
One of the things I like about that, actually, is that, I mean, a lot of this stuff is demo tapes, old tapes, and stuff that was never issued and so on. The recording systems were, in a sense, pretty primitive at the time. They had good bass sound on that, quite remarkable. The bands are still uniform, and they're still playing essentially what we call beat group, which is okay, rock and roll based, but quite British. But there are changes afoot, and of course one of the big bands in the Portsmouth area was Manfred Mann. Not strictly entirely a Portsmouth group, but they did many residencies, not only at Kimball's in Southsea, but at Kimball's literally across the road from here, the corner house here, and started very much rooted in jazz. So Mike Hugg, bottom right-hand corner drummer, actually starts as a vibraphone player in a group called the Modern Jazz 5 in Gosport. Paul Jones is a blues player who's played with Alexis Corner up in London. Manfred Mann is a jazz organist. Mike Vickers is playing alto sax and guitar and so on. There's a much stronger blues and jazz base to this stuff, and no uniform. That's a shift that's occurring around 63, 64. Some people did have uniforms. This is Barry and the Zodiacs. Barry Davis on lead vocals, and the very famous Lenny Tench on drums, whose shirt doesn't match the backdrop very well, really. The rationale, he tells me, for these shirts is that they had a special deal with a geezer who had a shirt shop in, I can't remember now, Osborne Road or somewhere. So that's how come they wore those. But you can see from the maracas that they're moving into the kind of Bo Diddley rhythm and blues, early rhythm and blues sound. And folk music. This is the big figure in Portsmouth folk music. Not just as a performer, but also as a musician. And I guess he's a name that's familiar to